A controversial rapper is back behind bars, now in the same detention center as disgraced music mogul Sean Diddy Combs. And it doesn't appear the New York rapper will be at home in time for Thanksgiving after he slapped with more jail time for violating the terms of his release from prison back in 2020. Daniel Hernandez, better known by his stage name Tekashi 6ix9ine, was initially thrown behind bars in late October for a number of violations. But what really threw the judge over the edge was the rapper showing up to court late with a not-so-great excuse. In February of 2019, Tekashi pleaded guilty to 9 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit murder and armed robbery. But he was sentenced to an astonishing 2 years in prison after he testified for the prosecution against other members of the 9 Trey gang. The following year, in April of 2020, he was granted early release due to the COVID pandemic and his high risk of catching the virus with his asthma, and was placed on house arrest, but finished that sentence in August of 2020. But the Fifi rapper hasn't exactly been a choir boy since his early release. In October of last year, he was arrested in the Dominican Republic after being accused of beating up music producers. Months later, in January of this year, he was arrested for domestic violence also in the Dominican Republic. He was arrested in Florida for driving more than 130 miles per hour in a 65 mile per hour zone. And prosecutors claim he took an unsanctioned trip to Vegas to attend a concert and lied to his probation officer about whether he'd left the judicial district in Florida. So when he showed up late to a court hearing on October 29th, the judge who also oversaw his release from prison wasn't very happy. And to make matters worse, Tekashi showed up to court an hour late, which prompted the judge to order his arrest. Lots to unpack in this story, and part of the reason we're able to keep bringing you these types of stories is because of our great sponsors, and that includes Upside. You might be asking yourself, what's Upside? Well, it's a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, and restaurants. Sometimes I only have time for a quick lunch break, but then there are times I can have a nice sit down at a restaurant, and I can use Upside for both. Plus, I can use Upside to get cash back when I do. It's so easy and simple to use and completely free, so why not? This is actual real cash back too. It's money that appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. Here's what you do. You download the Upside app, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. You pay as usual using a debit or a credit card, and then follow the steps on the app and get paid. You can use Upside at places like Chipotle, Taco Bell, 7-Eleven, and so many other places. So why not check it out and see if your favorite spot is on the app? To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on your screen, use our promo code LCNews, and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Again, that's promo code LCNews for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. But Tekashi had a reason for being late to court. He just didn't wake up on time. Prosecutors also revealed the rapper tested positive for meth and blew off a drug test. But Tekashi's lawyer claimed it was a mix-up and that he tested positive for meth because he takes Adderall, which contains methamphetamine. Manhattan federal judge Paul Engelmeyer reportedly said the rapper's actions showed a broader pattern of misbehavior and first ordered Tekashi be thrown behind bars until his next court hearing. When that court hearing came, the rapper wasn't going home. Instead, he was sentenced to jail, and the judge ripped him a new one. He reportedly told the Brooklyn rapper, "Your break of the court's trust is profound. Bottom line, I see a pattern. 5 violations says you don't believe the rules apply to you. Maybe you believe that's because you're famous rapper Tekashi 6ix9ine." Before he was officially sentenced, Tekashi reportedly copped to all of his probation violations and admitted he ignored an order to go to drug treatment and used a controlled substance that he shouldn't have. He also admitted to leaving the jurisdiction without permission, then lying about it. But his attorney had some concerns about his treatment now that he's back in lockup. He was ordered to MDC Brooklyn, the same detention center that houses other familiar faces like Sean Diddy Combs and Sam Bankman-Fried. According to Tekashi's attorney, he claimed the rapper was in solitary confinement for 2 weeks and had only gotten 1 phone call and 2 showers. The judge recommended he be let out of solitary confinement, but if let out of confinement, there's another potential issue. His life could be in danger after he ratted on his fellow gang members. But for the Dumbo rapper, he reportedly appeared apologetic and pleaded with the judge that he learned his lesson. He reportedly told the judge, "I'm very sorry. I want to be back home with my mom and brother. I'm feeling like I let them down. I don't want you to get the wrong impression of me. I make a lot of bad mistakes. I don't go out of my way to break the law. I tried my best, but I can do better." But his apology wasn't enough, and the judge ordered he spend 45 days in jail with time served, a sentence that was more than what prosecutors sought out for. And it doesn't appear he'll be able to get back on stage once he's released. Tekashi was also sentenced to an additional year of supervised release and ordered to spend his first 2 months out of jail at home, and he'll be on a curfew for a month after his home confinement ends. I'm joined now by reporter and author of Dummy Boy, Tekashi 6ix9ine, and the 9 Trey Gangsta Blood, and that's Sean Sotero. Sean, thanks for joining me today, and great to have you on. What's your reaction to 6ix9ine going back to prison for violating the terms of his release, and are you surprised?
So I have to say I'm not surprised by this outcome. He obviously had a number of legal problems during the terms of his supervised release, which was supposed to last 5 years from when he got out of prison in 2020. You know, he got into trouble somewhat in the Dominican Republic, and there were some other issues as well. I think certain aspects of this surprised me, but not the sort of overall arc of it, no.
And do you think that he just didn't take his probation seriously, knowing that he had this court date at a particular time and showed up not 5 minutes late, but an hour late? Do you think he wasn't expecting the judge to truly throw him back in prison?
I definitely think he wasn't expecting that. Look at how things went, right? He got 24 months when he was facing a potential much longer sentence, several decades. He even got out of the 24 months early because it was right in the early days of the pandemic and he had asthma. And so he got a release to, house arrest for the last months of his sentence. So no, I think, obviously I don't think he saw this coming. I think there's sort of a larger question here about probation and supervised release and conditions and, how many people have to abide by. But I would say in this particular case, yeah, obviously, he didn't abide by all of the conditions.
Yeah, and what do you make of Tekashi 6ix9ine's his excuse? I woke up late, but then in turn, he also pleaded with the judge not to send him back to the box. What do you make of just kind of his lax reasoning for not showing up to court on time, but then at the same token, knowing that there's always this possibility looming that he could go back to jail, he just pleaded with the judge not to send him back, probably in hopes that it actually wouldn't happen?
Sure. So the hour late to court was sort of already after there had been a number of problems, right? That happened as a result of a number of violations, which he ultimately pleaded guilty to, right? That was in New York when he was supposed to show up for a hearing. And, that certainly didn't do him any good, but the violations were already there. So even without showing up an hour late and having to, literally be arrested to make it to court, he might still have had the same outcome. This is the judge from the original case, right, who has been paying attention to this since Tekashi was originally arrested. And so he knows the whole story. He was in the courtroom and sort of the recipient of Tekashi's, what he said at the sentencing hearing of, I'm going to devote my life to turning myself around and all this kind of stuff. And so I think he, in particular, was definitely disappointed to see, some of these violations and other stuff that have gone on.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, Tekashi was already on thin ice since his release in 2020, arrested in the Dominican Republic, arrested in Florida for speeding. Prosecutors say he took an unsanctioned trip to Vegas for a concert. What do you make of his actions post-release, given that he was released in 2020? Now, 4 years later in 2024, he's back in jail. Why do you think this time was different from the other violations?
I mean, this seemed like, it kind of seemed like some of the stuff in the Dominican Republic, obviously it was public, but I don't know if it counted as violations of the supervised release because it was in another country. I think there was some ambiguity about that in the hearing and no one kind of wanted to dig too deep into it. It was a number of violations sort of all happened now. I think just a few months before he was set to, end the supervised release, right? He was coming to the end of this 5-year term when sort of all of these things, like you mentioned, the speeding arrest, there was an issue where he took non-prescription drugs instead of Adderall, and that led to a positive drug test. I would say the Vegas thing is, from my personal point of view, kind of technically a transgression, but I think it points to some of the larger issues in the probation and parole system in that he did text his probation officer to say, hey, I'm going to Las Vegas for this concert. It just wasn't in enough time, right? It was not far enough in advance so that they could know about it and approve it. And, I don't know what the bureaucracy is like or what the terms of his probation are exactly like, how far in advance he would have had to do it. But he was allowed to travel. He just kind of didn't let people know far enough in advance. That seems to me less of a serious violation. One other thing about this jail term could potentially have been several months on each violation. I think up to 3 months maybe for each violation. And the judge was willing to, I think, give him several months, but ultimately backed off because Tekashi had been in the box, right? He'd been in the SHU, the segregated housing unit, basically solitary. The judge has something in his order that he went down that he said, told the Bureau of Prisons, you've got to get this guy out of there. Like, that's inhumane. The judge ultimately doesn't have any control over that, right? The Bureau of Prisons sort of does what it wants. But that was a big factor in why Tekashi only got 15 days more than the state was asking for, as opposed to several months more than what the state was asking for.
And now that he's back in jail, do you think that he still has a target on his back, possibly from other gang members?
I mean, he certainly thinks so. I think this is the hearing got into a little bit about why he was in segregated housing. They weren't specific, but one of the people he testified against was in federal jail in New York until very recently. I think now he's in Pennsylvania, but up until very recently was in New York and was a very sort of well-known prisoner, right? When he was at MCC a couple of years ago, the federal jail in Manhattan, one of the people Tekashi testified against, he ran a contraband ring, right? And ultimately got arrested for that and now is serving additional time for that, pled guilty to that. So yes, I think certainly Tekashi seemed concerned. He seemed concerned about this one particular guy who I mentioned up until very recently was in this jail. Now is not, but, maybe has friends or associates. We don't know. I'm in speculation at this point. But yes, I think certainly there is potentially a very real danger of him being in a federal jail in New York City. For most of the time he was in jail while his trial was playing out, he was not in a regular federal jail. He was very briefly, but then he was moved, we later found out, to kind of a special prison in Queens that is, I believe, specifically largely for cooperating witnesses.
Do you think that because he was a cooperating witness and worked with the government, do you think in a way he thought maybe being on the outside and being released, he wouldn't be touched again as far as going back, or at all the possibility that he could go back to jail?
Look, I don't know his psychology, right? I've only ever spoken to him briefly. I don't know that much about what he was thinking. But if you look at his behavior, I think certainly there was not a ton of difference in his sort of public persona between the guy before and after. The crimes and the using the gang to rob people and all of that was obviously completely gone, all of the stuff he did prior to his arrest. But the general sort of, antagonistic, I do what I want, I'm throwing money around kind of persona was very much still there.
And in your opinion, do you think that Tekashi 6ix9ine will ever, in a way, clean up his act?
I hope so. I think one of the things about this particular situation that I haven't heard anyone mention yet is it actually could be very costly, right? And what I mean by that is he had signed a record deal reportedly for, I think up to $6 million relatively recently. TMZ reported about this. But part of the deal was he was to go on tour with artists in Mexico and South America. Part of the deal for the next 12 months is he doesn't have a passport anymore, right? No international travel as part of this new judgment for supervised release. So between that and a reported clause in the record contract about how he couldn't get any more legal trouble, I haven't heard anything definitive, but it seems like this potentially lucrative record deal may be in trouble. His sort of newest musical thing has been sort of Spanish language music, right? And if you can't leave the country to promote in primarily Spanish speaking countries, your career suddenly looks a lot less great.
Just going over Tekashi 6ix9ine as a whole, who he is as the person, why do you think that he continues to be such a polarizing and controversial figure in the rap game, beyond just him cooperating as a government witness, i.e. a snitch?
You know, I wrote about this a little bit in my book, which you can see behind me, right? Dummy Boy. He learned very early on that antagonizing people gets you attention, right? He learned that among his friend group. He learned that on the internet, and he took that to the heights of fame. He tried that on larger and larger scales and very briefly became, one of the biggest stars in all of hip hop. And I think that's a tough lesson to unlearn, especially when it worked so incredibly well. So I think that there is something about that idea that, I antagonize people, they pay attention to me, and I can then turn that into money and opportunities that doesn't seem like it's left him and maybe never will.
All right. Well, Sean, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this story. Before we sign you off, what do you think is next for Tekashi 6ix9ine?
I mean, what I hope is next is that he, obeys these conditions, some of them somewhat onerous. I just wrote a piece that your viewers can find on Complex about some of the probation conditions in the Young Thug trial. I think in general, the sort of post-release conditions that are put on people are worth looking at, not just for famous people, I think, but for people as a whole in this country. So I hope he is able to obey all of these conditions and do what he can. And in 12 months after this is all over, maybe he can go back to making music and touring in Mexico or Colombia or whatever sort of the next stages in his career is.
Yep. And I guess we'll have to wait and see what does come out next. Well, Sean, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
According to Tekashi 6ix9ine's attorney, the rapper should be out of jail in mid-December. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.